Hi, I'm Len Epp from Leanpub, and in this episode of the Front Matter podcast, I'll be interviewing Étienne Garbugli. Based in Rome, Étienne works at the intersection of technology, product design, and marketing. He's a 3-time startup founder, a 5-time entrepreneur, and a recognized user experience research expert. You can follow him on Twitter at eGarbugli and check out his website at etiennegarbugli.com. Étienne is the author of a number of popular books, including the main book we're going to be talking about today, Lean B2B, Build Products Businesses Want, second edition, and his recently published translation, Lean B2B, Créer les produits que les entreprises veulent. In the book, Étienne provides startup founders, entrepreneurs, and product teams with a playbook for building, validating, and selling business-to-business products in a world where products get hired and fired faster than ever before. In this interview, we're going to talk about his background and career, professional interests, his books, and at the end, we'll talk a little bit about his experience as an author. So thank you very much, Étienne, for being on the Leanpub Front Matter podcast.
Thanks for having me.
I always like to start these interviews by asking people for their origin story. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about where you grew up and how you found yourself interested in inventing things and technology.
So I was born close to Montreal in Canada, the other side of the country from you. And basically, if we're looking specifically at inventing things and all this thing, that's been there since I was maybe 4 years old. It was the building things with Legos or whatever it was, and kind of started with that. I think that to some extent that probably led me into the creative fields and more entrepreneurship. Kind of brought me to study communications, where it was a lot of different projects, different exploration across different media, different types of technologies. And then from there, I had a career working for larger corporations as well, working for eventually more startups, then starting out my own company, which was kind of the launch pad for starting a first startup around 2007, 2008. Which was specifically geared towards solving some of my own problems.
I've got a question, a sort of specific question about the timing of that launching of your own business.
Yes.
That I just learned. I didn't know it was in 2007 and 2008, and that is something that you actually mentioned in the introduction to your book. But before we do that, I when I was preparing for this interview, I listened to a couple of interviews you've done on YouTube, and you talk about I think your first experience with a computer, or you had early access to the internet because your dad worked for a company that anyone in Quebec will be familiar with, called Bell.
Yes. Yes.
And so, what was that like? What did you have actually, like, truly, like, kind of before all your friends and stuff like that?
Yeah, very much so. So my dad was in charge of technology purchases at Bell. So at some point, someone at school had mentioned, like, "Oh, that thing, the internet," and I was like, "The internet? What is that?" And then it turns out that we actually had it at home already. So I just asked my dad, like, "Oh, can I actually play with it?" And then you get the first experience where you're like loading a page really slowly. It's been that progressive discovery, but also like just that kind of, I guess, that wildness of the initial internet, where you could just basically discover so many things. The excitement that kind of came with that. Like last month, I was reading the book on Doom. Which is a great book. Like, it's a little bit older, but like this kind of reminded me that old period of the 90s where it was kind of like everything was kind of happening as new things as well. Like just the discovery of distribution platforms, the internet and all that stuff. It just got me back to this amazing feeling of like discovering the internet and kind of feeling like, okay, like everything's possible, which was just amazing.
And speaking of things being a little bit wild, I did my undergrad years in a very boring place called Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, but you were in a really much cooler place called Montreal, Quebec. And you went to Concordia, I believe?
I went to Concordia, studied communication studies.
And I just to give a little bit of color to your background, it's just sort of really interesting. There are actually lots of universities in Montreal, and lots of young people kind of in those years. What was undergrad life like as a student in Montreal?
It was a little bit of a scattered program, so it was interesting in terms of just being able to explore different things. So I got into like robotics. I got electroacoustic music. We talked a little bit about microphones before. I studied sound. My initial goal back then was to go and record, like do music for films, more or less. But that's kind of the path that I was on. I also like exploring other fields as well. So like kind of that broad sense of like creativity, which was a really good awakening in terms of just discovering like, okay, so you can create anything you want. You can kind of do this. And it's kind of led to some of the, I guess the drives to create new things or create products or create things like that. I think there's like a continuity somewhere in there.
Definitely, yeah. I think you mentioned in one of those interviews I just talked about sort of watching that, like it might not be apparent to others, but to you, there's this continuity in what you've done throughout your life of making things and inventing things and things like that, even though it might be in different spheres. And so, what were your first jobs in Quebec?
You mean as a teenager or as a
after you graduated?
Oh, so I was I ended up working for a French company that was doing. We were sending music and background images on cell phones. It was back when it was like WAP, like the technology. So that was quite interesting. It was my first experience of working for, I believe, a startup back then, and all that e-commerce process, like just the way you would actually monetize the business like that. So it was a very high-paced company, which was interesting, but also like a lot of freedom. And I still very much enjoy these times where you kind of like that small team working together on these things. And it's been an amazing first start of career. It kind of brought me to, I guess, the path where I was on.
Yeah, and so you eventually founded your own first startup. You said in 2007, 2008, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that experience. What was the name of it? What was it devoted to doing?
Yeah, so I was working. I started doing some consulting after working for larger companies, and I was working for an agency in Montreal called Sidley. They're actually pretty big in more the branding space and everything. And we were doing all these web projects, and I had some challenges in terms of like QA and just getting feedback and syncing everybody on projects. So we started working. So it was basically creating a layer on top of the web. So kind of creating something that kind of sits on the browser and allows people to add notes on the internet. So be able to share notes on any page anywhere on the internet. So that was an interesting experience. So that was a first startup without necessarily knowing how to necessarily take a technology product from start to the end, also get it funded and all that stuff. The funding space was also very different back then. Just so many mistakes that probably informed a lot of things that I did afterwards.
Yeah, and can you maybe give us an example of one or two of those mistakes?
I'd say like the biggest thing is basically we kind of ran out of money or ran out of momentum. We wasted way too much time just defining the thing before starting to get feedback. We eventually did a beta. We were able to get the interest of a bunch of different companies, but we were lacking some of the functionalities to actually wrap it together and kind of be able to sell it properly. And then also just the team structure. I was working with an agency as the partner in the business, so they had different interests. So it was kind of creating a little bit of a weird tension where the money in the business could also be attributed to different things, other ventures for them or other projects for them. It was kind of creating some clash. I think the setup that we were in was kind of like a bit limiting our ability to actually succeed with the business. But there was a lot of interesting things in terms of just the learning process and the self-discovery or self-confidence building. Just as a person, just kind of realizing, okay, like this is a completely new experience, but this is actually giving me X, Y, Z. I think I've grown significantly in that experience and kind of led me to starting up again.
Yeah, there's tons of interesting things we could talk about there. It's one of the things, the distinctions we should actually probably make before we go any further is between business to consumer or B2C and business to business products or B2B, which is of course what your book is about. But for people who aren't familiar with the terminology, I guess if you could maybe, because I think most people are familiar with when they think about a startup, a web startup or something like that, or a tech startup, they're thinking about business to consumer, not business to business. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit, but just at a high level, like what the differences are between those two types of companies.
I'd say that's a very good setup for this, because that's kind of the reality that the startup universe was like back then a little bit, where I think the setup or the way people perceive startups was very much tied to consumers product. So like mobile apps that target consumers, because there's way more consumers on the market, and oftentimes business products or business technology was associated with this idea of like the old software or the old enterprise solutions, these products that were very stiff or very old school a little bit. So a lot of the entrepreneurs were kind of going after more consumer opportunities, in part because they wanted to solve their own needs, maybe, or because they were also interested in things that they knew, or that basically the investors were also driving that messaging. Because back then it was there were more bigger successes in B2C, specifically with consumer software like Facebook, for example, and all these products that were kind of coming up, and we're just basically raising the bar and raising the ambitions of every entrepreneur looking at the space.
Yeah, it's a super fascinating distinction. I mean, when you're going business to customer, it's like, you've set up a platform and you sort of make it an interesting place to go, and hopefully it becomes popular and takes off. So, Facebook, WhatsApp, Google, for example, things like that, although Google's a little bit different. But when I think about, I've done a little bit of sort of B2B in my own life, and particularly an attempt at enterprise sales for a client and stuff like that. And like, the story I like to tell when I'm trying to explain it to people who've never heard of it before, you mentioned something about sort of older technologies being entrenched in businesses and stuff. And there's a just sort of famous story in sort of American business life where when the first sort of VCR was invented, and for those who don't know what that means, in the olden days, people used to only be able to play video with physical tapes, basically. And when this machine was first shown to a bunch of Disney executives, there would have been a television probably on a stand wheeled into a room with this VCR and on the stand as well. Someone would have put a tape into it and pressed play and probably played a Disney movie or something like that. And the executives kind of looked at each other and looked around and said, "You mean anybody can just walk in the room and watch it without paying?" And I just love telling that story, because if you want to know, like, selling into a business can be like, you can be like, "Oh, I invented this amazing thing. You can sell these tapes to everybody in the world and they can watch your movies whenever they want." And they're like, that completely destroys our business model in every way we think about everything. And it was only, basically 50 years later that Disney finally got into streaming. So I was just on that note, there's all kinds of interesting things when you're selling into a business. Like one thing you talk about, I'm sort of jumping ahead here a bit, but I don't want to go into the specific terminology that you talk about in your book, like change agent and stuff like that. But when you were doing your first startup, trying to sell a B2B product, what did you do? Yes. Did you identify, did you have like an Excel spreadsheet with a bunch of different businesses you wanted to contact, and then cold call or cold email people? How did you try to get in?
I actually would say it was much worse than that, because also, so if we're talking about books, basically, like, one of the things that led to my second startup was basically the amount of inspiration or excitement that came after the launch of the Lean startup, which I assume Leanpub is somewhat tied to in terms of the at least the mindset there. So at that point, the idea was basically to apply the Lean startup to a B2B concept and try to build a business. So we actually did like way worse than that. Like, we did landing pages trying to get people at like large, like 25,000 employee companies, companies, trying to get them to click on landing pages, or trying to get them like cold call companies, trying to get kind of pre-sale products there directly. We're trying all sorts of different things, trying to apply the techniques, or at least adapt them a little bit to the Lean startup, and adapt them to the reality of B2B. And that was quite difficult, because it felt like there was a little bit of let's say like a level of information that was kind of lacking, where we were kind of having these very consumer centric techniques that we're trying to apply to large organizations. But when you're dealing with a large organization, there's way more people in the organization, way more influences, way more voices at the table. So when you're selecting, for example, that TV that you're mentioning, or so you're selling something else, there's more people that get involved in the purchase. So it was just way easier to kind of get false positives or go in the wrong direction So it's very difficult to kind of feel like we're making the right progress or know how to make progress. So we're trying to kind of sell to a specific audience based on what we thought was the value proposition for a solution. But it was very difficult to kind of get a sense of progress or sense of having reliable information that we could actually build on to be able to get clarity on exactly what we should be building or what we should be putting together in terms of the value proposition that we're putting together. So there was a lot of like just going in circle a little bit where we built a bunch of different products. We felt like we're kind of going in circle a lot. It eventually got clear as we learned about the process, learned more about B2B and the specific aspects of B2B. But that was a little bit like walking in the wild and kind of trying to find your way without necessarily having the right vision of exactly where you're trying to get to.
And I thought you were just talking about your second startup, but the first one was 2007 and 2008 as well, which is super instructive, right? Because I would imagine about B2B sales, because, for example, you could get that meeting with the big company and you show up, and you sort of, go to the top floor or whatever floor you get to. And then everything can be going well. And then there can be just some catastrophic economic collapse. And then everything can just blow up.
Yeah. Or basically you don't necessarily know how to move the relationship forward. Like we were lucky enough to get good meetings with large organizations, but then if you're not sure exactly how to, like you're trying to follow let's say a lean approach or something like that, or you're not exactly sure how to best get clarity on how to sell to the organization without having to overcommit or have to build something up front as a solution, it gets very, very muddy in terms of pushing things forward or making progress.
I can imagine one of the, there's just so many challenges with that, but one of them would be, if you've got a sort of big whale that you're trying to land, and then one person in the meeting is like, oh, we'd love to have this feature, and someone else is, we'd love to have that feature, and we'd love to have this one. And you can be like, how do we, but then you've got another sort of potential client who's just, not interested in any of those things, but you've got limited developer and design time, and you've got to find a way to sort of make design decisions in those contexts.
Absolutely, but it's very tricky because you don't want to build anything based on just the voice of one customer. So you're trying to, whatever you define as the right path or the right solution, you kind of want to make sure that there's other potential customers buying this. Like we had this situation at that point where we were engaging with someone very senior at a large gaming company in Montreal, and that person it's very rare. We were in HR, very rare that the HR people will be actuaries, so very much like math driven, like very, very much like calculating everything in terms of numbers, ROI, all these things. So it just gives you completely different perspective than what you might expect from other organizations, even the same sector. If you spoke to other VPs of HR at other organizations in gaming, for example, you would probably not get the same perspective. There's a lot of these little challenges that you need to navigate in terms of in your attempt to get the right information and gain some validated learning that you can actually build on to build the right product for the right audience.
Yeah, it sounds like you're definitely battle hardened going into everything and going into gaming companies in particular, I imagine. But before we go on to talk about your book and the first edition and how that came about, and then the second edition, we just wanted to get to know you a little bit more. So we sort of started with you in Montreal, starting these startups and things like that. But I know that you also ended up working for ThoughtWorks for a while, and you've traveled a lot, and you spent some time in China and things like that. So if maybe you could build up a little bit more of your story there.
So around that time, so between the first and the second startup, I had the idea. I've always had the desire, the drive to go live abroad, and I was fascinated by going to the places where I guess the innovation, maybe finding a little bit what we mentioned before about like the 90s, that feeling of things being like super active and things are being evolving really quickly. And at that point, and even today, like in Asia, like the whole mobile space was blowing up. So my idea was to move to Hong Kong, join either a game studio, join a company that was working in the internet space in China, and kind of see what was happening over there, and see how I could actually level up my skills and grow, learn new things, kind of rediscover that fresh growth a little bit. So I ended up going to Hong Kong, and then the market in Hong Kong was a little bit, I guess, deflated a little bit. So maybe not the best time to go find a job there. I ended up meeting someone who connected me with someone from Beijing. I ended up doing 3 interviews, got hired in Beijing, and ended up working in China for a little while, which was a very, very interesting experience. Probably more on probably equally on the business or the learning side as from the human side. There's the personal growth aspects, and that kind of set me up to kind of decide that I was not necessarily going to stay and live in Canada long term, and kind of made me want to explore more parts of the world and kind of keep traveling.
And did you have to get a special visa to live and work in China?
Yes. So there's a bunch of different tests that you need to pass.
Oh,
well, at least at that time that you needed to pass, like L tests. You had different background check as well. You had to send your school grades. You had to prove that you were actually very good in your field. All these different things on top of the test. Like ThoughtWorks is notorious for the amount of tests that they make their employees or people that apply for the company go through. So they're like psychological testing, all these different things. So it was a very interesting process, and so it's been an interesting growth experience.
That's interesting. Actually, that's a bit of a digression, but I didn't know that ThoughtWorks had a kind of robust kind of testing process for employees. But I've had a number of former ThoughtWorks people on the podcast, and quite a few Leanpub authors are ThoughtWorks people. Oh yeah.
Okay, that's very interesting.
Yeah, I know, and they all have a sort of like I've never really narrowed it down, but there's a certain, they're all different from each other in all kinds of ways, but there's a sort of consistent flavor to a kind of competence and kind of quickness, I suppose, that they must select for.
Yeah, so ThoughtWorks is a company that really built a lot of its own IP, its own like mindsets, and a lot of these things are actually they were actually early adopters of many things, including continuous delivery, or a lot of the ideas of Martin
Fowler.
Yeah, Martin Fowler, like who was actually working in the company still back then.
Mm-hmm.
Like all these things, so they have a lot of these mindsets, and it's been interesting because they do feel a little bit of, at least the people that I've met, they do feel a little bit of frustration that a lot of ex-Thought workers just kind of go out of the company and kind of write a book about the processes that they have or the ideas that that are kind of commonplace in the company. And there's a few of these. I think Jeff Patton is an ex-Thought worker. I might be wrong, but around like user mapping or something like that. But like, yeah, I remember having a discussion about that specifically, and there were a bunch of different approaches as well that probably could have been turned into books back then, but maybe now or have evolved quite a bit if you were still working at ThoughtWorks.
And what was life, just very briefly, what was life like as an expat in Beijing?
It's a very interesting experience, especially back then, like where the rates between let's say the USD and the yuan were very different. So it was very much like a feeling of everything is possible. Like they cracked down a little more on like on the foreigners that were living, the foreign experts. But back when I was there, it's still very much a thing. So you had a category of experts that were working for organizations, were paid quite well, had really good positions in these organizations. And it was an interesting community, and you could sense that it was starting to really bubble up in Beijing, for example, also in the south of China. So you could sense, like I met a lot of different innovators, different people in different types of company when I was in Beijing. It was very, very interesting. You could sense that like things were going to pick up. There were more and more local firms that were starting to innovate globally, more things that were coming out of China. And in the last 10, 15 years, like you've really seen it actually start being a much more common occurrence.
And eventually you just became a kind of world traveler, and now you're in Italy.
Yeah. Well, it's actually a little more complex than that, but like, yeah, I've kind of made the decision that I was not going to live in Canada long term. So I used the Lean methodology to kind of find where I was going to live. And this has taken me 2 years all the way to here, where I was lucky enough to get the citizenship in Italy.
Oh, you got citizenship. Oh, that's fantastic.
Yeah, during the pandemic, that was a side project during the pandemic.
Yeah, it's interesting. You mentioned you a couple of times. You don't just apply sort of lean methodology to sort of B2B or startups or something like that, but it sort of can be applied more widely to all kinds of different things, including books. So just before we segue into the next part of the podcast, where we talk about the origin story of the first edition of your book, I do have to mention that the very first Leanpub book was Startup Lessons Learned, which was Eric Ries's first book, which was based on his blog. So Leanpub started out as a blog to book kind of thing, and our first one was Eric Ries's blog, which it's funny, like I said, another thing you could apply lean methodology to is your blog. And so I think he was the person whose first post was like, "Low, my 5 subscribers," or something like that, right? But like, you've got to start for every process in life. You start somewhere, and you pay attention to what you're doing. And if anyone's curious, like, get the Lean Startup. It's a really great book. It transformed a lot of things. But the sort of core of it is, remember that you've always got to start somewhere with everything, and just pay attention to what's going on. Be open-minded, be willing to change, but really pay attention to the signals that you're getting from the people that you talk to.
Yeah. And it's a little bit like sometimes you don't realize that there are signals and you just get it in hindsight. I think that's probably the beauty of, I guess, trying to evaluate your experience and kind of seeing the patterns that kind of came out of it.
Yeah, and exactly. And another thing you can apply it to is publishing books. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what the origin story was of your. I mean, I would imagine Lean B2B may not have been your very first book, but how did you get into writing and publishing books?
Actually, Lean B2B was my very first book.
Oh, okay.
Yes. So in I think I probably always a little bit had that in the back of my mind that I wanted someday to be an author. I had no real plans, like fixed plans of when I was going to do this. So when I ended up closing up my second startup, Our Voice was the name. I ended up writing a postmortem on my blog. Just like one night, it was 4 a.m. I was just typing things on my computer. And then I just shared it. And the next day I had a bunch of different people that had seen it, that had been shared on Twitter, and actually got invited to give a few talks, but also it got featured, I think, in the Toronto Star. I like to think one of the newspapers in Toronto, the largest city in Canada. And that kind of, I got some feedback from the actual, the journalist who was kind of telling me, like, he was like, this is really interesting. You should kind of think about writing about this, or writing in general. This kind of got the process going, especially I was still kind of trying to figure out where we had gone wrong throughout the process. Like there were the obvious mistakes that we made, but there were also like overall, like how could I actually have done this differently to get a better outcome out of the startup? So I kind of got a little bit obsessed. And sometimes I do that. Like I got a little bit obsessed about figuring it out. So I spent the next 3 months interviewing B2B founders, trying to get their experience, trying to capture a little bit their process, how they think about getting product market fit or building a startup, picking ideas, and kind of getting customers, getting users. I did this for a while, did a lot of research. The more I kept going, the more I started building out some sort of methodology that I wasn't necessarily thinking so much about. I was just putting together a book. I was trying to make it make sense. And then maybe a year and a half after that, I ended up publishing the book after a few series of testing. So I did testing with several readers for the first book as well. And I launched the book, sold the first copy in the first hour. And then it's been a gradual increase in sales over time. Actually, I just basically wanted to do this as an experiment back then, but it did end up that I would get feedback, get invited to different places. I think we froze.
Yeah, that's okay. But you're talking about the benefits.
Yeah, there were a lot of benefits, but not necessarily just the sales. But ended up, when I applied for a company, when I ended up having an interview with the company I worked at afterward, the startup, the CEO had actually read the first 90 pages before an interview. So I kind of got hired because of the book to some extent. I got invited to a bunch of different things that I probably would not have had. And over time, it just kept building. And I kept realizing that the market or the world, the startup world, was shifting more and more towards B2B. So whereas at the start, there were very few B2B startup. If you spoke to investors, they would kind of try to find the B2C angle, the consumer angle in your company. And the more it went, the more it became B2B centric, more and more companies targeting different segments and companies. And it kind of validated some of the things that I had taught initially when I was considering spending 1,000 hours working on the book on this case. Sometimes I am right.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. There's a lot to talk about there, but and including we had Dave Farley on the podcast not too long ago who wrote the Continuous Delivery book, and he talked about how he and his co-author they spent about that amount of time at least on their book as well. And while they're in the middle of it, they're like, is anyone ever going to read this? There's a lot of questions that you ask yourself, and we can talk a little bit about the process afterwards. But but the book was sort of great, very well targeted. Obviously, everyone knew about Lean and stuff like that, and then there was Lean Startup. But again, what you sort of noticed was it says Lean Startup, and that's generic, but it was mostly business to customer. So you were B2B, which, and it's interesting. You write about how that one of the reasons that shift towards sort of B2B company creation and success happened was because people realized businesses have a lot of money to invest in products.
Yeah. And that's been interesting as well, because when I look at I pretty much do continuously, I try to categorize the buyers that I find of the book, kind of look at their backgrounds. I kind of try to speculate on the reasons why they're buying the book and what their interest is. Whenever I get information, I try to improve the understanding. So looking at the personas that came out of that, and it's been way more than just B2B founders. I think that's probably 50% of the buyers, but then it goes into other segments like researchers in school or like innovators, innovation consultants who really help promote the book and push it in a bunch of different businesses. So it's been really interesting just seeing that play out. And it kind of helped inform the other books that I did, where I was like, okay, even if I'm trying to do a book on specifically kite surfing in the Bahamas, there's still going to be people that are going to be picking up that book to learn how to do skateboarding. That might be an extreme example, but there's always unintended consequences or unintended audiences that kind of come out of your original target, I would say.
I can totally imagine that. I mean, in particular, if anyone in sales, basically of any kind, there's now we can go into a few of the details of this, and we'll go into some of these most of these will be from the second edition and stuff like that. But just again, I mentioned that Disney story before, but to talk about sort of a personal experience I had, sometimes you can get the big meeting for your B2B product. You can be there. You've flown there. Go through security. You've got the badge. You're in the office, and you realize there's someone in that room whose last promotion was based on bringing in the product that you're trying to replace.
Yeah.
It can be incredibly tricky, and so you've got all kinds of really interesting kind of insights and observations on this in your book. And just one I wanted to zero in on was gatekeepers and saboteurs.
Yes. Sorry.
No. I just please go ahead and talk a little bit about your approach to thinking about those people in that situation.
Yeah. So it kind of came out of the gap that I felt was missing, or the pieces that I felt were missing from the Lean startup when it came to working on B2B or enterprise product, where the whole relationship building aspect was kind of missing out of all this. So doing a lot of exploration, I kind of went back to sales books from the 70s and all these things where you kind of figure out these concepts actually very much apply to a customer development process, or a process where you're kind of trying to validate or test things in organization. So I think one of the big value adds, I think, of Lean B2B, the original version, was kind of tying these two universes together a little bit, where you have that complex sale universe from new strategic selling, for example, and bring that together with the lean startup, where you have the really quick learning cycle, but tie it with a more, I guess, relationship-driven environment. And gatekeepers, for example, are a big part of that. You're mentioning a good example, but like there's a bunch of different flavors of that, of reasons why companies may not be willing to adopt an innovation, even though it would provide a greater benefit from their company. So just helping people think through that situation, help them kind of get a sizing of the companies they go in, I think has been a good value add for people that have read the books.
And just to give people a little kind of, Easter egg or something like that, if you encounter a saboteur, do you have any sort of specific advice for what one should do in that situation?
Well, yeah, I think one of the key thing that came out with it from this is that the way you sell something to a team means you're actually dealing with, let's say, 5, 6, maybe 7, 8 different people that all have different win results or different things that you're looking for out of this. So you can actually sweeten the pot for some of these people. So you need to kind of speak to them, understand their reality, understand why they're being saboteurs, why they're trying to sabotage the deal, and kind of figure out if there's a way to kind of either build more benefit for them specifically, or find a way to kind of get around them and still get the deal going.
That's interesting. So one step you can be is like, think about why are they trying to sabotage it, and what interests do they have that I'm maybe not addressing, or how am I framing things that seem antagonistic to their interests when I should frame them otherwise?
Yeah, I think that's one of the big parts, is understanding the perspective of multiple people and trying to adapt your communications or your approach to these different voices, different perspectives.
And what's a wedge?
Oh, yes. So that's more from the second edition of the book. So there's a lot of different approaches that were discussed in the first book that are kind of into that idea of the beachhead market, where you have an entry point in the market. So kind of based on the idea of how the Allies took the beaches in Normandy by focusing on a very, very narrow beach point where they actually put all their troops. So the more focus you have on that small sliver of a market, the more you're able to provide benefits. So if we put that in the concept of a product, so if you have something that only targets dentists in Denver, you can be very, very, very specific about the offering that you put together. So you can speak to all of them. You can build something that really is 10 times better than the other solutions that are out there. And you can really have something that's very specific. So in the second edition, because I tried to kind of make that even clearer and kind of crystallize the elements that should be part of the wedge and the concept. So trying to find a formula that's a little bit more, a little simpler based on the interactions I've had with the founders over the last 8-9 years.
Yeah, you mentioned that the wedge concept is mostly in the second edition. And so that gives me an opportunity to ask you, what was the, I mean, you talk about it a lot in the video that you've got about it and about that and things like that, but about like what was the sort of like, what changed between the first and second edition that led you to write a second edition?
Yeah. So one example that I kind of use, and it's just one space, one category, more or less. There's this great analysis that a blogger did on the number of tools that were available in marketing in 2010, I believe. There were 250 of them, and today there's 11,000 of them. So just the amount of extra noise, extra complexity, extra competition that's available, that's on the market, kind of forces founders, especially in B2B, to kind of find a really more specific, a narrower wedge to be able to kind of get that the initial attention and be able to get their foot on the market, be able to kind of start learning and kind of build their products from there. So now it's a lot more difficult to kind of find the right opportunity to start with. So they have something that's very specific. It's also much more dynamic in terms of the market, and the customer expectations have very much changed, in the sense that before, if there were just a few products in the category, you could actually work with the customer over time. And now you kind of have to do this faster. So you need to learn faster. You need to be able to provide value faster. So lead with value a little sooner. So there's different types of products that fit a little more the new reality. And the book is kind of restructured around the idea of building something that really works today based on what's been working in the last few years and what seems to be going the trend forward.
Yeah, that's really interesting. That touches on something I in one of those interviews that I listened to you talk about, was how I think, if I got this right, that it's much, if you're in the B2B space, it's much actually more like people from these companies are going shopping for different products now in the past, rather than like, they get a meeting with you and they expect to have sort of like, pitches and sort of interactions back and forth. It's a lot more going shopping. And I mean, one of the biggest examples of that happening and sort of was Slack, for example, that, in the past it was like, how did you get a company to adopt your product? Well, you had meetings at high levels and you took people out to dinner or whatever, just whatever cartoon idea you had. But with Slack, it was like people just started using it. The only reason they could do that is because kind of corporate culture changed, where it was okay to kind of have a small team just use their own tool and things like that.
Yeah, and the whole product-led growth playbooks, a little bit that idea of like teams could actually discover and start using in the company, and then there would be some expansion of the accounts. So these new ways to drive product to market are kind of also complexifying this. The shopping model has changed completely as well. Oftentimes, the buyers, or maybe someone not even in the not even the actual team function in the organization, maybe in procurement, will try all the different products.
And that actually gives us an opportunity to move to the last part of the interview before we go kind of full feature length. But to talk about your book writing process and things like that, and all of these things are interconnected. So you mentioned earlier about the first edition of the Lean B2B book that you tested it, and I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about what you mean by that.
Well, so I would say that at that point it was a little bit very much basic. So I had roughly 10 people that read the book, read the different iterations of the book, and kind of gave me feedback, gave me thoughts about it. But it was mostly that. I did a little bit of testing as well on the titles, the subtitle title. But for the other books that I did afterwards, I went much further, where I started doing more like different cohorts of testing. Basically, I would launch a new version of the book and have maybe 10 people read it at the same time, give me feedback on the book. I tested as well the visuals. I tested as well the title. Did a lot of analysis based on data from Amazon as well, just to kind of find the right positioning for the content, but also the right mix that kind of connects well with the audience that I'm going for. It's been interesting because like I remember like when so Lean B2B has been selling constantly, but my other book, Solving Product, is actually my best-selling book. And it's been interesting because I got feedback from some of the same people that actually read the first iterations of Lean B2B, and they were like, I don't get it. Like, I don't get who this is for. But then if you look at the specific audience that I'm actually targeting, those people very much get it. So it's also like making sure that you have the right product for the specific audience that you're going after. And sometimes that kind of means like turning off audiences that would have got value from, I guess, a book that is less focused, or a book that is a little bit less tuned to the actual audience that you're targeting. So I've been experimenting a lot with like the formats and the way how the format can help with the actual learning objectives of the people that are reading the book. So to help make it a little more useful, or sometimes I have more replay value in the book a little bit. So it's been an interesting process, but there's a lot of testing that kind of goes there.
Yeah, that's a very fascinating process. And, we could go very deep into the weeds about the whole concept of a new edition, deep in the weeds of the publishing and authoring world, and what that means to the author, what that means to the audience, why you would position something? Why not just create a whole new book with a whole new title? Why create something with the same title but second edition? And it's really interesting, right? Because you can have people who are like, well, if I bought the first one, what do I need the second one for? And there are other people who are like, I can't wait. It's even better now or updated. And there can be audiences that are excited and disappointed. And in particular on Leanpub, actually, I won't go into that too much, but since we have new versions, we have to explain the difference between a new version and a new edition.
Yeah. But they're all very expansive experiments to some extent. So if I look at my book series, more or less, like the second edition is a second edition. There's all the complexity when shipping on Amazon, for example, that they don't necessarily differentiate or relate the books so easily. So it creates some interesting dynamics in terms of marketing and the terms of how the people select products, basically, because one has way more reviews because it's older and the other one has less reviews because it's starting. So they're actually not, it's difficult to kind of gauge them together. And I've also written a book that is kind of like, I don't remember what the right word is, but it's basically just, it's a sub book to another book. So my book, Finding Your Market, is a sub book to Lean B2B. So kind of a reversal of the methodology. And that's been interesting as well, because you're talking about the same overall audience that you're targeting with the same, a different product. So it's been interesting experiments. And that's been kind of one of my learnings in the past few years is they're quite costly experiments, like books. Especially if you're like, okay, I'm going to spend whatever, like 800 hours working on this, and the outcome that you get can be quite significantly different depending on the book, depending on the marketing, depending on the audience, depending on everything.
Yeah, that's really fascinating that you mentioned this sort of sub product. One thing that at the end of the new book, the second edition, you actually talk about next steps for B2B entrepreneurs, and then you sort of point people to a bunch of other resources that you've created in addition to the book. And I can imagine there's people who sort of find the resources first, and then they get led back to the books as a kind of a form of inbound marketing or something like that. But also, it's like it's a really amazing thing to do at the end of a book to sort of point people to more stuff that you've done that they can get and use. So it's not like the book's over, this is all I have to say. Instead, there's even more of you and your stuff for people to look at and discover.
Yeah, it's the author platform. I think that's definitely something that should be, like, I'm always trying to push a little further. I think more authors should be doing more on that front. Like now, like the solutions that I use are pretty sophisticated, like the email retargeting, all these different things. I have like automated process for everything. Like it's a lot of work, but it's definitely worth it. Just in this sense of being able to kind of build a relationship with some of the audience that have read the book. Like I've done none of that for the first iteration of Lean B2B, and like I don't even want to think about how much further my business would be if I had done this from the start and like captured, let's say, I don't know, 25% of all my readers' email address over the years and kind of nurtured that over the years. Like it was just something I feel was not done as much back then, but now I think is getting more and more in that direction. And I'm still trying to experiment and try to push that a little further.
I would say we at Leanpub know exactly how you feel. If we knew now what we knew then. But yes, specifically, I mean, something that people, probably anyone who's made it this far and is listening to the sort of in the weeds publishing sort of stuff would know all. But the email newsletter basically is an incredibly important way of marketing and keeping and growing an audience and things like that. Encouraging people to share their email address with you, or just get them to sign up for your newsletter and things like that can be a great way of keeping them interested, selling other things to people that are, but also knowing exactly what's useful to them and what they want, and things like that. When it comes to, as it were, sub products, I wanted to ask you a little bit about what you think about audiobooks. I saw you tweeting about that recently.
Yes.
And that's actually something. So a lot of people are like, okay, well, if I knew 10 years ago what I knew now, well, one of those things that people are really thinking about now is audiobooks. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your experience with that and what your thoughts are as a successful author about audiobooks.
So like I created an audiobook version of my first book. and I try to quantify like the amount of work, put that into like dollar amounts of like the investment that I put in. In that case, like I've made back the money on this. It's been profitable. It's been good in that sense. But you've seen over the years that Amazon's kind of squeezing the author more and more, and like asking for exclusivity and all these things. And this year, I think they changed as well the pricing model. I think that was the initiating point for this. I just think personally, I think you can make more money by having less formats available. And you've seen authors that have actually done that. There's an author that I'm thinking about that we actually removed this Kindle version for the same reason, because the perceived value of a paperback copy is higher than Kindle version. So by removing the Kindle version, maybe you sell 30% less, but at the end of the day, you make more money. So I've been kind of toying with that idea, but I'm pretty sure it's the case with the audiobook, because at the end of the day, I make I don't know, $3 per copy sold on the audio copy sold. So like it's easy for me to just shift that more to, I don't know, have to a Kindle or something else. I think at the end of the year. So I think it's kind of experimenting a little bit with the sales revenue across this, and I think there's also competition between different platforms. I think Amazon also prefers its own platforms where they get the higher margin of the sale. So I think there's a lot of mechanics in there that are not very advantageous for the authors, where you brought the cost of production and then you get the smaller share of profits. I do think there's more platforms that seem to be coming up with, for example, was the one that was coming up for audiobook with BookBub, the other one, Crisp, I think, or something like that. So they're coming out with new platforms where you can actually listen to audiobooks and kind of pay fair rates. I think that might be better, but at the end of the day, I don't feel that this is a very fair exchange for authors that actually are making a living off their books, and probably worse for authors that are not making a living off book royalties.
Yeah, thanks very much for sharing all of that. That's like incredibly useful information for anybody who's thinking of doing an audiobook themselves, including keeping in mind quantifying things, which I know is something that you do in all the different aspects of your life. But like, note things down. How productive is this? Is it sort of like, does it have sort of cumulative growth kind of that it's bringing to my life, whatever it is, whether it's publishing books or, I don't know, imagine working out or something like that. But with respect to audiobooks, my sort of, kind of pub table opinions about that kind of thing are like, when you see those old pictures of airlines from when airlines, it's sort of like, it was like a sort of had to be a grand experience, you know what I mean? Where like it's fashionable and things like
taking
that.
The plane. Yeah.
Taking the plane. And I think a lot of people, when they think of the audiobook to this day, they're like, oh, it better be Benedict Cumberbatch kind of doing the audio, and it better have, great sound with a nice microphone done in a studio and things like that.
Yeah, as well.
But and a lot of people think that, but then in the end, actually people are just like, they're like doing their jog and they've like got it on 2x speed, and they've got their own preferences for how they want to consume it. And particularly with nonfiction books and books about self-improvement and things like that, for a lot of people to kind of, as it were, the kind of the production quality is much less important to them than the quality of the writing and the words and the ideas and things like that.
Yeah.
And so I think that my view is that a lot of like actually what audiobooks are going to probably converge for nonfiction books, what audiobooks are going to converge on is basically a kind of informality. As long as it's consistent, basically, as long as the production is consistent, people are going to be okay with things. So for example, I think on Medium now, just for free, you could just click a button and it'll play the audio for the post.
I do that all the time for books as well. I get the PDF, I upload it with read aloud in my browser, and I read the book this way. I think that's kind of the experience that you're mentioning. Like it's consistent. I get it audio. I can do other things at the same time, but I can also like play it back, and I have a visual. I think that may be a stronger experience than just having audio, because if you're taking notes, especially for a business book, then I just did one. I just read one and by audio recently, and just taking notes afterwards, where you need to like refer back to like different moments in the book, and then you're trying to transcribe the idea just to keep track of it. It's just, I think it's probably very, very good for all the fiction books as well. Like that's probably like you want the experience and all these things. But for business books, also looking at the unit economics of and the amount of money that you're getting from it. Like there's a reason why a lot of authors that are more indie authors, like you look at Rob Fitzpatrick, for example, like he's not creating audio versions of his books, even though he's selling way more than me. But like in this case, I think it makes sense. Like you're actually cannibalizing a little bit of your sales. Like you may be adding some of the top revenue, but is the effort or the investment worth it? I would very much, I guess, suggest to other authors to look at languages instead of audiobook. I'm looking at I did a translate. Like my first language is French. So I did translation of my email marketing book into French. It took like a year to be paid back if I look at all my costs and everything on this thing, and now it's just driving profit. And now I'm slowly expanding into more languages like that. Like if you can keep the cost of production low for other languages, you can sell longer tail, longer term for the books in markets that don't have as much competitivity in terms of the books. So I think that's very interesting, especially if there's a AMS version for the country, for example, like France, where you have an ad platform and you can promote it properly to the audience.
Yeah, no, that's really great advice. Particularly, I would say that I've got two things I would add about that. One is that when it comes to audiobooks on Leanpub, for example, we have had some authors experiment with that, and what they do is we actually have the ability to create packages, so you can add arbitrary digital content to your book. So what people will do is they'll sell the book, and then they'll sell the book plus audio version, and then people can just download an MP. They'll get the book and they can download as what we call an extra. They can download the MP3, and so what they'll do is when someone goes to a Leanpub book landing page, they can see the book or the book plus audio book, and then that'll be for a higher price. And then you can sort of, that's a really good way of quantifying like how much actually is it sort of
the actual version, right? Yeah, that's
because
good.
You can see how many people are buying just the book, and then how many people are buying the book plus the audio book, and obviously the difference there sort of tells you what difference that's making. But I would add specifically about translations. This is a very old Leanpub story. Years and years ago, I don't remember who it was or what the book was, but a Leanpub author discovered that someone had translated their book into Russian and was just selling it. And instead of getting mad or calling the cops, what are you really going to do? But they got in touch with the translator and said, I've got a new book coming out. How about you translate that, but we actually share the revenue from your translation this time. Yeah. And the person was like, great. I didn't mean to be a thief. I just loved your book and wanted to translate it, but I was a little bit intimidated. It was something like that. So anyways, translations are great.
I'm about 300% sure that there's a Chinese version of Lean B2B somewhere. I just have no idea or no way to actually find it. I don't know exactly where to look, but I'm pretty sure there is. Yeah.
But I mean, as long as your name's still on it, people are still learning about you, and
let's hope that's the case at least.
Let's hope that's maybe not, but anyway, so I love telling that story because it depends. It all depends. I mean, when it comes to self-publishing or even being an author generally, it all depends. What are your goals? Is it to get a job, like you were talking about? Is it to get clients if you're a consultant? Is it just to build a platform because you just like that idea and you've got a mission that you're on?
I think that's definitely a good question to ask yourself, in terms of the way you price, the way you do all these things, kind of should be a reflection of your actual goals or strategy or whatever you're trying to do. A lot of things that I mentioned are based on the fact that I'm trying to maximize my ability to write another book or have enough funding to be able to keep going as an independent author as well.
Yeah. Well, Étienne, on that note, thank you very much for taking some time out of your day to talk to us and to talk to our audience about your book and your background and your experience and everything like that. I'm sure it'll be very useful for a lot of people. Just before you go, the very last question I like to ask, if the guest on the podcast has been using Leanpub, if there was one terrible thing that you always, whenever you go to upload a book on Leanpub, was sort of had you shaking your fist at us from a user experience side, or if there was one magical feature we could build for you, can you think of anything you would ask us to do?
Can I be honest?
Yes, oh, for sure.
Yes, I can't find the link to actually add the book. It always takes me 15 minutes to find it.
Okay. Yeah, no. So yeah. So what's happening there is so when you go to create a book on Leanpub, we've got like Leanpub /.com/create. You pick a mode, and in this case, you would pick the upload writing mode. And what Étienne's saying is that like finding the place to actually go upload the book is just tricky and hard to find. And that's one of those, we've had that feedback before, and it's something that we're working on fixing, including potentially actually like doing what basically everybody else does, which is upload the book right there. Like if you're going to upload book mode, you've already got a book ready, and probably actually uploading it at the book creation step, rather than making you go anywhere to find it afterwards, would probably be the best thing.
I think that's my situation at least, but yes.
Yeah. Okay. Neil, thanks very much for that. And we very much value honest feedback here. Insofar as Leanpub is sort of usable at all, it's because people have told us what they really think over the years. So yeah, thank you very much, Étienne, for being on the Leanpub Front Matter podcast.
Thanks for having me.